Welcome back to the Eclectic, where we sit with the stories that refuse to sit quietly. Tonight's story takes us to Brazil and the strange case of the lead masks. On a hill outside Niterói in Brazil, a boy flying a kite made a discovery so strange that it would outlive the people involved, the original investigation, and even the era in which it happened. Two men were lying dead in the grass. They were dressed in suits. They wore waterproof raincoats, and over their eyes were crude, handmade masks cut from lead. At first glance, the scene looked almost theatrical, like the aftermath of some private performance or ritual. But there was nothing performative about it. These were two real men, both electronics technicians from Campos dos Goitacazes, and both dead under circumstances that have never fully been explained. What happened on that hill in August 1966 has become one of Brazil's strangest unsolved mysteries. A case with a note that sounds like instructions, masks that suggest protection, and a timeline that points toward an appointment with something unseen. And the deeper you go into the details, the stranger it becomes. Because the lead masks case is not just about two men found dead. It is about intent. It is about belief. It is about whether they were carrying out a scientific experiment, a spiritual ritual, a drug-taking ceremony, or something else entirely. And to this day, no one can say with certainty which of those possibilities is closest to the truth. The hill at Niterói. Morro de Ventum is not a place most people would choose to die. It is a hill on the outskirts of Niterói and Rio de Janeiro state, and in the middle of the 20th century, it would not have seemed especially remarkable to outsiders. It was not a famous landmark, not a tourist site, not a place associated with grandeur or symbolism. It was just a hill with rough terrain and enough isolation to make it suitable for things that were meant to remain unseen. Well, that matters because whatever happened there in 1966 happened away from crowds, away from easy witnesses, and away from immediate explanation. The bodies were discovered on the 20th of August 1966 by a local boy who was flying a kite. He spotted something unusual on the slope and alerted authorities. When police arrived, they found the bodies of two men lying side by side in the grass. The men were identified as Manuel Pereira de Cruz and Miguel José Viana. They were both electronics technicians from Campos dos Goitacazes, a city several hundred kilometres away. They were not the sort of men one would automatically expect to appear in the centre of an enduring occult mystery. They were working men, skilled men, men who repaired, handled and understood devices. That detail has always mattered because it gives the case a grounded quality. This was not a pair of anonymous wanderers who simply stumbled into the wilderness. These were people with trades, routines, and presumably some practical relationship to the world around them. They left home on the 17th of August 1966. According to later reconstructions, they told the family they were going to buy electronic parts and possibly a car. They took money with them. They travelled by bus toward Niterói. Somewhere along the way, their journey stopped being ordinary. What they intended to do once they reached their destination is where the case begins to split into theories. The last trip. The men's final journey has been reconstructed from a patchwork of reports, witness accounts and later summaries. They appear to have arrived in the Niterói area during the afternoon. One of the most commonly repeated details is that they bought raincoats and a bottle of mineral water while they were there. That may sound mundane, but in this case, the mundane details are what make everything else feel more convincing. Raincoats, well, they would suggest they expected exposure to weather. Water, well, that would suggest they expected to be somewhere for a while. The notebook, though, is the real centerpiece. At some point before their deaths, a small notebook was found among their effects, or at the scene. It contained a short set of instructions in Portuguese. The wording varies slightly between secondary sources, but the structure is consistent. It gave times, it referred to ingesting capsules, and it mentioned protecting metals and waiting for a signal while wearing a mask. In one of the most repeated translations, the note reads something like this: 1630, be at the determined place. 1830, ingest capsules. After the effect, protect metals, wait for signal mask. That is not a sentence that explains itself. It sounds coded or abbreviated or written for people who already understand the context. The note has become the case's most haunting clue precisely because it reads less like a message to the police and more like a set of steps in a private procedure. What kind of procedure? A meeting? A ritual? An experiment? A drug session? A contact attempt? The note does not answer. It only deepens the mystery. And it does one more thing. It suggests the men were expecting a sequence, not a spontaneous event, but a scheduled one. Something was meant to happen at a specific time after they took the capsules. Something that required a mask. That is why the lead masks matter so much. The masks are the reason the case never settled into a simple explanation. Each man was found wearing a crude eye covering made of lead. They were not elegant items. They were not professionally manufactured. They were homemade, cut from lead pipe sections or similar material, and shaped into something roughly like a sleep mask or a visor. Lead is heavy. Lead is associated with shielding. Lead is the metal people immediately think of when radiation is mentioned. So the natural question is obvious. What on earth were they trying to protect themselves from? The masks make almost any theory more dramatic. If the men had been poisoned, why the masks? If they were planning a ritual, why lead? If they expected a light or radiation source, what exactly were they expecting to see? The homemade quality of the masks is especially important. Police reportedly found evidence later that suggested the men had made them themselves, from lead pieces. If that is correct, then the masks were not planted by a killer. They were part of the men's own preparation. That changes the tone of the case. A planted mask would suggest a staged crime. A homemade mask suggests intent. It implies the men arrived on the hill already committed to whatever they were doing. And that makes the case harder, because intent can point in more than one direction. It can point towards science, towards spiritualism, towards secrecy, delusion, or toward a combination of all four. When authorities examined the bodies and the area around them, there were no obvious signs of struggle. That detail has been repeated often because it narrows the field of possibility. There were no clear indications that they had been attacked in the conventional sense. No obvious wounds, no dramatic marks of violence, no reason from the visible state of the bodies alone to immediately conclude murder. But that does not mean the scene was simple. The men were dressed oddly for a hilltop in August. Suits, raincoats, and lead masks. Around them were items that suggested they had planned to be there. There was an empty bottle of mineral water, there were wet towels, there was the notebook, and there was money. One reported detail is that a plastic bag containing a significant amount of cash was found with one of the men. That has long fed speculation about robbery or about some unexplained financial transaction that never became clear. Then there is the issue of time. The bodies were not discovered immediately. They were found several days after the men had vanished from public view. By the time forensic examination was properly underway, decomposition had already complicated the picture. That matters a great deal because in cases where drugs, poison, or unusual compounds may have been involved, delay can erase the very evidence investigators most need. So from the beginning, the case had a built-in problem. The evidence was already slipping away before it could speak. The police response was serious, but the available tools of the time were limited. Officers searched the area, examined the belongings, and tried to reconstruct the men's movements. Later, their homes and workshop in Campos were also searched. Reportedly, investigators found signs that the men had been making lead masks previously, along with other lead fragments and unfinished items. That became one of the major pillars of the idea that the masks were not random or symbolic in the abstract. They were part of a larger plan. The police also tried to understand the men's motives by talking to family members and acquaintances. From there emerged the most important strand of background in the case, the possibility that the men were involved in spiritualist or esoteric experiments. Several later accounts suggest that two men had attended spiritualist meetings and had taken part in earlier experiments involving lights or luminous beings. One version of the story says they had gone to Atafona Beach for an earlier contact-style experience, although the reliability of the detail varies between retellings. Still, this part of the story has endured because it offers a framework that connects the masks, the note, and the hill. If the men believed they were preparing for some kind of contact event, then the whole scene becomes at least internally coherent. The masks would protect their eyes. The capsules would alter consciousness. The signal would be the moment of manifestation, and the hill would serve as a secluded meeting place. That theory does not prove anything, but it does explain why the case became so famous so quickly. The note is worth pausing on again, because almost every theory depends on it. The most commonly cited wording is brief, awkward, and cryptic. It mentions a time to be in a specific place. It mentions capsules. It mentions an effect. It mentions protecting metals. And it mentions waiting for a signal. It mentions the mask. Those words do not belong naturally to one genre. They could be read as technical, ritualistic, or coded. Each word opens a door, but none of the doors lead to a completed room. The mention of capsules is especially significant. It implies ingestion. It implies that the men expected to take something into their bodies as part of the process. That something may have been medicinal, hallucinogenic, toxic, or symbolic. We don't know. The phrase about protecting metals is one of the strangest parts of all, because it is hard to parse clearly. In the rough English versions, it has often been rendered in ways that sound almost broken or compressed. That could reflect a poorly preserved transcription, a shorthand personal note, or simply the limitations of translation from the original Portuguese. Either way, the note is not a clean piece of prose. It is an instruction set. It feels like something created for people already inside the plan. The men behind the mystery. It is easy in cases like this for the strange details to overwhelm the human beings at the centre of the story. But Manuel Pereira de Cruz and Miguel José Viana were real men, not symbols. They were electronics technicians. They lived in Campos dos Coitiqueias. They worked in a field where improvisation, repair, and practical knowledge were part of everyday life. That means they were likely comfortable with tools, wiring, and components. It also means they may have been the sort of men who were curious about more than just basic repair work. That curiosity is important. Many interpretations of the case depend on the idea that the men were not naive in the general sense, but interested in something beyond ordinary electronics. Some Brazilian press accounts and later writers describe them as people involved in unusual experiments or spiritualist inquiry. That is the problem with cases where the subjects are technically skilled. Their competence makes almost any theory seem possible. If they were handling components, perhaps they were testing equipment. If they were experimenting with altered states, perhaps they were trying to combine science and belief. If they were building masks, perhaps they were preparing for a visual event. Their background can support multiple readings at once, and that is what keeps the case unsettled. Of all the theories, the spiritualist one is the one that has had the most staying power, and it is easy to see why. The masks are dramatic and strange. The note sounds ceremonial. The hill gives the event an isolated stage. The possibility of earlier luminous encounters adds a supernatural edge, and the absence of clear violence leaves room for a voluntary act gone wrong. Under this interpretation, the men were preparing for a contact event of some kind. Maybe they believed they would see a manifestation. Maybe they thought the capsules would alter their perception. Maybe they expected some form of communication or revelation. In that framework, the lead masks would not be absurd. They would be precautionary. If the men believed a light or energy source would be involved, then protecting the eyes would make a kind of strange sense. The problem is that belief is not evidence. It is entirely possible that the men were involved in spiritualist circles. It is entirely possible that they believed in luminous beings or psychic experimentation. But even if they did, that still leaves the actual cause of death unresolved. Did they take too much of a substance? Did they inhale something? Did they simply die from the physical strain of the evening? Did the ritual itself mask a more ordinary end? The theory is coherent, but coherent is not closure. A different reading of the case treats the men not as mystics, but as improvised experimentalists. This version argues that the men may have been involved in some kind of technical or pseudo-technical test. They were electronics technicians after all. They understood equipment. They may have had a fascination with high-voltage ideas, radiation, or unusual devices. The lead masks in this telling were a crude attempt at shielding from light, radiation, or some other harmful effect. There are pieces of this theory that feel attractive. Lead is a shielding metal. Technicians might well experiment with protection methods. A remote hill would provide privacy. Raincoats and water would make sense if they expected a difficult environment. Capsules could have been part of a mental or sensory experiment. The difficulty is that there is no evidence of the device itself. If the men were testing something, the object of the test was not found. No machine, no generator, no meaningful apparatus. And that absence weakens the theory badly. It also leaves the question of why the men would need masks for any practical electronics test in the first place. Still, the case has always attracted those who think the answer lies in some kind of private technical experiment that failed catastrophically. The capsule note has led many people to a simpler conclusion. The men took something that killed them. That something could have been a drug, a poison, or a mixture of substances. The lack of visible trauma supports the idea that there may have been no external attack. The delay in autopsy makes toxicological certainty impossible. The note explicitly mentions capsules, which seems too specific to ignore. If this is what happened, then the masks may have had nothing to do with the actual cause of death. They could have been part of the ritual environment, or even symbolic objects associated with the men's beliefs. One version of the theory imagines a self-administered hallucinogenic or spiritual experience that went wrong. Another imagines a misunderstood or mismeasured chemical test. Another suggests the men were trying to induce some form of visionary state and underestimated the risk. The beauty and the frustration of this explanation is that it fits the known facts without over-committing to any one speculative detail. It explains why there were no obvious injuries. It explains why the note mentions capsules. It explains why the forensic results were inconclusive. But it still does not explain the masks. The masks remain the hardest part of the entire case to dismiss. The murder theory. Then there is the idea that the men did not die alone. Some accounts suggest that a portion of the money they took with them was missing or never recovered, which naturally leads to the speculation about robbery. If someone had lured the men to the hill, perhaps under the guise of an experimental meeting, then stolen the cash after their death, that could explain several elements at once. It would also fit the absence of obvious struggle if the men were deceived rather than overpowered. The challenge with this theory is that it lacks a named suspect. There is no solid chain of evidence pointing to a specific person who organised the meeting, supplied the capsules, and took the money. No one was charged. No one was identified as the culprit. There is no known witness who can place a robber at the scene. So while the murder remains possible, it is the kind of possibility that lives in the negative space of the record. We can imagine it, we can sketch it, but we cannot prove it. And in mysteries like this, an unprovable murder theory can survive for decades because it explains the emotional shape of the case, even when it cannot satisfy the forensic one. The UFO theory. This is my favourite theory. If you leave the case in the public imagination long enough, it begins to acquire a life of its own. That is what happened here. The masks invited comparisons to radiation. The note invited speculation about signals, and the words luminous beings became fuel for UFO interpretation. Soon enough, the case was being retold as if the men had gone to the hill to meet something not of this world. It is an irresistible story. 2 men, a cryptic note, lead masks, a hilltop, a vanished encounter. But the problem with the UFO reading is the same as with the rest. There is no contemporary evidence for it. No radar return, no witness to an object, no official report of a strange aerial event. Just the latter tendency of people to map the unexplained on to the extraterrestrial. That does not mean the theory is impossible. It means it is culturally powerful but evidentially weak. And that distinction matters. The reason the lead masks case remains unsolved is not because investigators did nothing. It is because the evidence they had was just not enough. The bodies were discovered days after the men had vanished. By then, decomposition had advanced. Autopsy and toxicology in the 1960s were far less capable than they are today. Many substances that might have been identifiable with modern techniques could easily have escaped detection then. If the men consumed a drug, it may have broken down. If they were exposed to a toxic compound, the trace may not have survived. If there was an environmental trigger, it may never have been apparent in the first place. That means any confident statement about cause of death goes beyond the record. All we can say with honesty is that the police found no obvious external violence and no definitive internal answer. That is not much, but it is enough to keep the door open to multiple interpretations. A year later, the bodies were exhumed in the hope that a new examination might yield something more useful. It did not. The exhumation became part of the case's history precisely because it failed to transform the case into a solvable one. The promise of later certainty evaporated, and the mystery remained. That is often the moment when a case turns from investigation into folklore. Once the official tools have been tried and have failed, the public begins to own the story. Writers, broadcasters, researchers, and internet users all begin to fill the gaps with their own preferred explanation. The lead masks case was perfect for that process. It had just enough evidence to feel real and just enough uncertainty to feel supernatural. Why the case endures. There are many unsolved cases, but very few have this particular combination of ingredients. The first ingredient is visual. Lead masks are unforgettable. They do not resemble anything ordinary, and they immediately suggest danger, mystery, or ritual. The second ingredient is narrative. A note reads like an instruction manual for something that should make sense, but it doesn't. The third ingredient is atmosphere. A hill, a boy flying a kite, 2 dead men in suits, the raincoats, the water, the silence. The fourth ingredient is uncertainty. No cause of death, no named suspect, and no official resolution. Put those together, and you have a story that refuses to stay in one category. It is a crime story, an occult story, a science story, and a psychological story all at once. And maybe that is the real reason people cannot let it go, because the case seems to ask a question that never quite gets answered. How much of our reality is visible, and how much of it only becomes clear when it is already too late? If you strip the case down to its safest conclusions, this is what remains. 2 Brazilian electronics technicians, Manuel Pereira de Cruz and Miguel José Viana, left home on the 17th of August 1966. They travelled to Niterói. They were last seen heading toward Morro de Ventum. On the 20th of August, they were found dead on the hill, dressed in suits and raincoats, wearing homemade lead-eye masks. Near them was a note that referred to a place, capsules, a time, a signal, and a mask. There were no obvious signs of violence. The autopsy was inconclusive. The case was never solved. That is the factual skeleton. Everything else? That's interpretation. Maybe they were part of a spiritual experiment. Maybe they were testing something technical. Maybe they took the wrong capsules. Maybe they were deceived. Maybe they were trying to see something that could not be safely seen. Or maybe, for reasons we may never recover, they were simply caught in a private plan whose logic died with them. Whatever the truth was, it ended on that hill. And nearly 60 years later, the lead masks case still stands as one of the most unsettling reminders that not every mystery is designed to be solved. Some are only designed to be remembered. If you found this story compelling, please follow, rate, and share the show. It helps others discover these deep dives into the strange corners of history. And if you have a family legend of your own, half truth, half ghost story, I'd love to hear it. This has been The Eclectic. Stay curious, stay questioning, and as always, stay eclectic.